The airport buzzed with the usual chaos, families dragging luggage, business travelers absorbed in their screens, children darting between tired parents. Yet amid the familiar rush, something felt off. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Williams had been through airports too many times to count, but as he stepped inside, a strange unease settled over him. He adjusted his uniform, the polished insignia on his chest catching the fluorescent lights above. He had a mission, a duty that went beyond protocol, beyond paperwork. He was escorting a fallen soldier home. Sergeant Jake Thompson, 23 years old, gone too soon. Mark inhaled deeply, trying to shake the feeling creeping up his spine. Maybe it was just the weight of the mission, or maybe it was something else. As he approached the airline counter, his boots clicking against the tile, he noticed the subtle shift in the air. The terminal was climate-controlled, yet a cold draft curled around his neck. The hairs on his arms stood on end. He placed his orders and ID on the counter. The young woman behind the desk barely glanced at him as she typed into her computer. Then suddenly, she froze. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, a flicker of something. Confusion, hesitation, fear flashed across her face. Mark narrowed his eyes. "Is there a problem?" The woman licked her lips and forced a stiff smile. "One moment, sir." She turned and whispered to her co-worker. The man's eyes darted to Mark, then to the sealed casket draped in the American flag. He stiffened, his face paling slightly. Mark had been in combat. He knew when someone was hiding something. "Excuse me," he said, voice firm. "I'm escorting a fallen soldier. Everything is in order." "What's the issue?" The woman didn't meet his eyes. "There's a security protocol, sir. We can't allow you to board at this time." A pulse of cold ran through him. "Security protocol? What policy prevents a military officer from escorting a soldier's remains?" Behind him, a murmur rippled through the line. People shifted, watching the exchange unfold. A few passengers had pulled out their phones, quietly recording. The woman swallowed and stepped back as a supervisor, a man in his 50s with a sharp suit and a name tag that read Ronald Reeves, approached. His smile was professional, but the tension in his posture was impossible to miss. "Colonel Williams," Reeves said smoothly, "we're experiencing an issue with your flight. It's just a precaution. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. Mark had seen this type of carefully worded avoidance before. On the battlefield, in negotiations, in situations where people were hiding something dangerous. Then the lights flickered. For a split second, the entire terminal dimmed, as if something unseen had drained the energy from the room. The background chatter died. The air turned thick, heavy. And then, a whisper. Not from Reeves, not from the agent, from behind him. It was soft, like a breath against his ear. A voice that wasn't supposed to be there. "Don't leave me." Mark turned sharply, but there was no one there. His heartbeat pounded in his chest, his breathing was steady, but his instincts screamed at him that something was wrong. The power flickered again. This time, the overhead announcement system crackled, static hissing before a voice distorted through the speakers. "He never came back. He never came back." Passengers murmured. A child clung to his mother's leg. Reeves paled. The woman at the counter stepped away from her desk, hands shaking slightly. Mark tightened his jaw. He had been on too many battlefields, faced too many nightmares, to let fear control him now. But this was something else, and deep down, in the part of his mind he refused to acknowledge, he knew. Sergeant Jake Thompson wasn't ready to go home. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Williams squared his shoulders, his military training keeping his frustration at bay. He had faced war zones, high-stakes negotiations, and moments where life and death balanced on a razor's edge. But this, being denied, If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss out on more thrilling stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and share this story with those who need to hear it. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our latest videos. See you in the next exciting and meaningful story. Flight for a mission as sacred as escorting a fallen soldier felt different. It felt wrong. The airline supervisor, Ronald Reeves, stood firm behind the counter, his professional smile not quite reaching his eyes. Sir, I understand this is important, Reeves said, voice carefully measured. But we can't allow you to board at this time. It's a security protocol. What protocol? Mark's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. I've done this before. I know the regulations. There's nothing preventing me from flying. So why don't you tell me the real reason? Reeves hesitated just for a second. His fingers twitched at his side, and his eyes flickered toward the casket behind Mark. Then the terminal lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back fully. The fluorescents above buzzed, casting erratic shadows that stretched unnaturally along the floor. The electronic flight information board glitched, numbers shifting rapidly before resetting. And then there was the whisper. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but Mark heard it. A low, dragging breath, followed by words that curled around his ears like ice. You left me there. His stomach turned. He spun around, scanning the terminal. Nothing. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A woman in line clutched her husband's arm. A young man holding his phone glanced between Mark and the airline staff, his brows furrowed in confusion. People were sensing it too. Mark turned back to Reeves, his pulse steady but his instincts screaming. What's really going on here? The airline agent who had originally denied him the flight looked like she wanted to disappear. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. Then, behind Mark, someone gasped. A little girl, no older than 6, was pointing. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "Why is that man crying?" Mark's blood ran cold. The mother knelt beside her daughter. "What man, sweetheart?" The little girl pointed directly at the casket. Mark turned sharply. The American flag lay perfectly still over the sealed coffin. Nothing was out of place. But that feeling, the weight in the air, the suffocating cold, grew heavier. Reeves cleared his throat, snapping Mark's attention back. His face was paler now, his forced confidence cracking. "We need to move you to a different flight, Colonel," he said quickly. "This one isn't safe for you." "Not safe?" Mark took a step forward. "You're telling me this isn't about protocol. It's about something else." A drop of sweat slid down the side of Reeves's face. Then the flight information board glitched again, but this time it didn't show destinations. It showed a date. June 17th, 2021. Mark's breath caught in his throat. That was the day Jake Thompson died. A sharp, ear-piercing screech erupted from the airport's PA system. Passengers gasped, covering their ears. The sound vibrated through the terminal like nails on a chalkboard. Then, in the chaos, Mark heard it. A deep, rattling breath right behind him. "You never came back for me." This time, he didn't turn around, because he knew, if he did, he wouldn't like what he saw. The tension in the terminal had transformed from mild confusion to something much worse, fear. Passengers whispered nervously, shifting in line as they glanced between Mark and the airline staff. The flickering lights, the distorted voice over the PA system, and the eerie way the flight information board had glitched. All of it was sinking into them now. Something was wrong. Mark could feel it too. Years of combat had sharpened his instincts, taught him to recognize a threat before it struck. But this? This wasn't like anything he had ever faced. He kept his stance firm, eyes locked on Ronald Reeves, the airline supervisor who was still trying, and failing, to maintain control of the situation. "Colonel Williams," Reeves started, his voice thin, "please, come with me, we can—" A loud thud cut through the air. Everyone flinched. The sound came from behind Mark, from the casket. Silence swept across the terminal. Even the children, who had been fidgeting and whining just moments ago, had gone eerily still. Mark felt his pulse hammer against his ribs, but he forced himself to turn around. The casket remained sealed, the American flag still folded neatly over the top. But the air around it had changed. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the shadows cast by the overhead lights seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally. Then a sharp gasp broke the silence. A woman standing near the back of the crowd clutched her chest, eyes wide. "I just saw—" She swallowed hard, voice shaking. "I just saw something move." Under the flag. A man beside her turned pale. "Me too." A young guy, barely in his 20s, lifted his phone, recording the scene with trembling hands. "Dude, this is messed up." Mark forced his breath to stay steady. This isn't real, it was just a trick of the mind, just paranoia. But then, the flag moved. Not much. Not enough to be mistaken for a draft or an accident. It shifted, like something underneath was breathing. Several people screamed, others stumbled backward, phones shot up, cameras rolling, Mark's entire body locked into place. This isn't possible. Then the voice came again, not over the PA, not from the whispers of frightened passengers, but from inside the casket. "You left me there." The words weren't loud, but they might as well have been a gunshot. A middle-aged man in a business suit dropped his coffee. The cup hit the tile, splattering brown liquid across the floor. No one moved to clean it up. Reeves took a shaky step backward. His hands were visibly trembling now. He knew something. Mark turned back to him, voice low, controlled. "Tell me what's going on." Reeves opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the power cut out. The terminal was plunged into total darkness. Screams echoed in the black void. Someone knocked over a luggage cart. A child wailed. Then through the chaos, a single chilling sound broke through. The sharp, metallic groan of a coffin lid shifting. Mark reached for his sidearm instinctively, but he had none. He wasn't on the battlefield. He was in an airport, surrounded by civilians. And something was in the dark with them. Then the lights flickered back on. And Mark's heart nearly stopped. Because the casket was open. The second the lights flickered back on, a collective gasp swept through the terminal. The casket was open. Mark's breath caught in his throat. That shouldn't have been possible. The military transport caskets were sealed tightly, locked from the outside. Even turbulence wouldn't have been enough to budge it. And yet here it was. The lid shifted slightly ajar. Passengers backed away, their fear now a living, breathing thing. Some ran. Others fumbled for their phones, recording in trembling hands. The terminal no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a tomb. The air was wrong, heavy, cold, suffocating. Mark's instincts screamed at him to move, to step back, to get away from whatever was about to happen. But he didn't. He stepped forward. The air around the casket seemed to hum, a low, vibrating frequency that rattled in his bones. Every soldier knew that kind of silence, the kind right before an explosion, when the world holds its breath. Reeves, the airline supervisor, looked like he might pass out. His hands were still shaking. He knew something. Mark clenched his jaw. "What the hell is going on?" Reeves didn't answer, because at that moment, the casket lid slid open, not violently, not in some supernatural burst of movement. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if someone inside was pushing it open. A woman screamed, a man cursed under his breath. People stumbled back, knocking over chairs and carry-on bags. Mark's entire body was tense, his pulse pounding. He should have run. But instead he looked inside. Empty. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The casket was empty, no body, no uniform, just the American flag, folded neatly as if no one had ever been there. Passengers whispered in shock. Someone was crying. And then the smell hit him, a stench of damp earth and decayed flesh. It was faint, almost like a memory. But it was there, the unmistakable scent of a body left to rot. Mark staggered back, covering his nose, his stomach twisted. The smell wasn't from the casket, it was in the air. It was everywhere. Reeves looked like he was about to collapse. His face was pale, drenched in sweat. He stumbled away from the counter, eyes darting around wildly. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This isn't real." Mark grabbed his arm, forcing him to focus. "What do you know?" Reeves swallowed hard, his breath shaky. "He never left." Mark's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean he never left?" Before Reeves could answer, the PA system crackled to life again, and this time the voice wasn't distorted. It wasn't static. It was clear, raw, and filled with pain. "You left me there." A wave of nausea hit Mark. The words clawed at his skull, dragging up memories he had buried deep. Memories of the mission, of what happened that night. The sound system crackled, and then footsteps, software measured. Coming from the empty casket. Passengers ran, phones dropped to the floor. Reeves let out a choked sob. Mark turned back, muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at him to move. Because now, something was standing beside the casket, something in a tattered uniform, something that should have been dead. The terminal had erupted into pure chaos. People screamed, scrambled over chairs, and rushed toward the exits. The security alarms blared, but no one paid them any attention. Because standing beside the empty casket, bathed in the flickering airport lights, was something that shouldn't exist. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Williams locked eyes with it, his breath shallow. The figure wore a tattered military uniform, its edges frayed, its fabric stained with something dark. The name tag was barely visible under the layers of grime and decay. But Mark knew that name. Thompson. Jake Thompson. His heart slammed against his ribs. This isn't real. This isn't possible. And yet the figure was there, its face, pale, sunken, with bruised hollows where eyes should have been. Tilted slightly, as if observing him. The air around it warped, a sickening wave of cold pressing against Mark's chest. Then it moved. Not like a living person, not with normal steps. It glided, silent, unnatural, as if gravity had no hold on it. The PA system crackled again, and through the speakers, the voice came. "You never came back for me." Mark staggered back. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen in place. The memories hit him like a gunshot. The mission, the jungle, the enemy ambush, and the last time he had seen Sergeant Jake Thompson alive. 6 months ago. The last mission. A monsoon raged through the jungle, rain slashing down in torrents. The mission had gone sideways. The extraction was compromised, enemy forces closing in. Mark had made the call, a brutal, necessary call. "We have to move, now." Thompson had been hit, bad. He wasn't going to make it, but he had grabbed Mark's vest, eyes wild, desperate. "Don't leave me." Gunfire ripped through the night. The team had no choice. They had left him behind. Present day, the reckoning. Mark's pulse pounded as the ghostly form of Thompson stood before him. "You left me there." The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was filled with rage, with betrayal. The air in the terminal turned suffocating, thick like smoke. The fluorescent lights above flickered violently. Sparks showered from a nearby sign. And then the shadow moved, fast. Mark barely had time to react before an unseen force slammed into his chest. He flew backward, crashing into a row of airport chairs. Pain exploded in his ribs, but he forced himself to stand. Around him, the terminal had transformed into a nightmare. Lights shattering, monitors glitching, alarms screaming. Passengers were trapped. The automatic doors refused to open. Then the glass windows started fogging up. But not from temperature, from words. Written by unseen hands, they formed over the glass in shaky, jagged letters. "Why did you leave me?" Mark's throat tightened. He had faced death 100 times. But this was something different. The figure of Thompson was getting closer. "You should have saved me, Colonel." Mark's grip tightened into fists. He didn't know if he was about to fight or beg for mercy, because Jake Thompson wasn't looking for justice. He was looking for revenge. The airport terminal had become a battlefield of terror. The lights overhead burst one by one, plunging the space into flashing darkness. Emergency alarms blared, but the sound was distant, drowned out by something else. A deep, ragged breathing. Mark struggled to his feet, his ribs aching from where he'd been thrown. Around him, passengers huddled in terror, their eyes wide with panic. Some were desperately trying to pry open the locked doors, others were whispering prayers. No one could escape. And in the chaos, Thompson's ghost loomed closer. Its form flickered between solid and shadow, its hollowed eyes locked onto Mark. The air around it shimmered like heat rising from asphalt. But this wasn't warmth. It was death. Then the voice came, curling around Mark's skull like smoke. "You left me." Mark gritted his teeth. "We didn't have a choice, Jake." The ghost twitched. The words weren't enough. The lights overhead surged, glowing an unnatural, sickly yellow before exploding in a rain of sparks. The PA system crackled, distorting, and through it came laughter. Thompson was laughing. The ghost lifted its hand. Mark's body went cold. A force wrapped around his throat, invisible but crushing. His boots scraped against the floor as his vision blurred. He clawed at his neck, but there was nothing there. Passengers screamed. Reeves, the airline supervisor, fell to his knees, his hands clutching his ears as if trying to block out the sound of the ghost's voice. "You let me die." The airport windows shattered outward, glass spraying across the tile. Wind howled through the terminal, but it wasn't from outside. It was coming from the casket. Mark's vision darkened, the world blurred, spinning, his body losing its fight against the force that held him. Then, through the chaos, a voice cut through. "Colonel Williams." A figure burst through the security checkpoint, a man in military uniform. Mark hit the ground as the pressure around his throat vanished. He gasped for breath, coughing. The new arrival moved quickly, his presence sharp, commanding. Major Richard Simmons, U.S. Army. His boots pounded against the tile as he stepped between Mark and the ghost, his voice like steel. "Thompson, stand down." The ghost of Jake Thompson froze. For the first time, its flickering form hesitated. Simmons reached into his uniform and pulled out something. A medal. It glinted under the erratic flickering of the emergency lights. A purple heart. Thompson's purple heart. The ghost's form wavered, the rage in its eyes flickering like a candle in the wind. Simmons' voice softened. "You were never forgotten, soldier." The wind howling through the broken windows began to die. The thick, choking air lightened. Mark, still gasping for air, watched as the ghost's anger twisted into something else, something broken. Regret, pain. Thompson looked down at his own hands, fading, trembling. The shadows began to peel away from his body. His voice came one last time, but this time it wasn't rage, it was a whisper. "You should have come back for me." Then, like mist caught in the morning sun, he was gone. The airport fell into stunned silence. The nightmare was over, but for the airline, for the people who had witnessed it, the consequences were only beginning. 7. The aftermath. When the living pay the price, the airport terminal stood in eerie silence. Broken glass crunched underfoot, papers and abandoned luggage scattered across the floor. The security alarms had finally died out, leaving only the distant hum of emergency lights flickering weakly. The air still held the weight of something unnatural, like an echo that refused to fade. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Williams pushed himself upright, his body aching from where he had been thrown. His throat burned where the invisible force had nearly crushed the life out of him. His heartbeat was still erratic, his mind racing to process what had just happened. Jake Thompson was gone, or at least, he had let go. Major Richard Simmons, the Army officer who had intervened, stood a few feet away, still clutching the Purple Heart medal that had finally calmed Thompson's restless spirit. His face was pale, his hands steady, but his eyes were filled with something Mark had rarely seen in a seasoned officer. Fear. Mark swallowed hard and looked around. The other passengers, the ones who had seen everything, stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Some were whispering, some still trembling. A few clutched onto each other as if afraid to move. Then someone muttered the words that would set off a firestorm. "I got it all on camera." Mark turned his head sharply. A young man, probably in his 20s, was gripping his phone tightly. The screen was still recording. His face was pale, but his fingers moved fast, already typing. Uploading. Mark's stomach twisted. In a matter of minutes, the supernatural encounter that had nearly killed him would be out in the world. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Within an hour, the video had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments. It wasn't just on social media, major news outlets picked it up within the day. Headlines ranged from the skeptical to the downright terrifying. Army colonel attacked by ghost at airport, real or hoax? Unexplained incident causes mass panic. Passengers swear they saw a spirit. Government cover-up. Military involvement raises questions about supernatural encounter. And then came the real damage to the airline. Customers demanded answers. Stock prices plummeted. Employees resigned, refusing to work at the haunted terminal. Veterans organizations called for an official investigation into Jake Thompson's death. Under mounting pressure, the CEO of the airline released a public statement. He called the event an unfortunate misunderstanding, claiming technical malfunctions had caused the chaos. No one believed him, especially not the people who had seen Thompson standing there. Mark's final mission. A week later, Mark stood in a quiet cemetery watching as Sergeant Jake Thompson was finally laid to rest. This time, the burial was done right. A full military honors ceremony, a proper farewell. Mark stood at attention as the flag was folded and handed to Thompson's family. A cold breeze swept through the cemetery, ruffling the trees. It sent a chill down Mark's spine, but not from fear. From something else. As he turned to leave, he felt it. A presence, not menacing, not angry. Just there. He exhaled slowly and murmured under his breath, "You're home now, soldier." And for the first time in weeks, the air finally felt light again. But one thing was certain: the world would never forget what happened at that airport.